everybody, and welcome to the latest CODA webinar. Today, I'm absolutely delighted to bring you a webinar where we're going to welcome the two authors of the study that we've recently released, looking at a skills review of the Australian oil and gas decommissioning industry. That will be starting in a couple of minutes, but before we get started with that, I want to acknowledge that we're meeting here in Perth on the lands of the Whadjuk people of the Noongar Nation, and pay our respects to their elders past, present and emerging. Thank them for their continued contribution to our society, and very much look forward to continuing to work with them and the Indigenous peoples all across Australia with the decommissioning journey as it moves forwards and as we get into more and more of this work. So I would like to present to us Kristy Delaney and Ashani Seneviratne. Kristy is the Workforce Transformation Leader with Deloitte, and Ashani is their Engagement Director. Between Kristy and Ashani and their team of specialists, they've executed this work for us over the last few months. And the two of them are now going to share with us, I guess, the journey of discovery that they went through to pull the report together, the findings and recommendations from the report as well. So if I can hand over to you, ladies, please, to take it from here.
Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us today as we are excited to launch this really important study that is hopefully going to help to propel decommissioning in Australia. So the purpose and objectives of the study was really to acknowledge that we're at a point in time in Australia where we really need to prepare for the decommissioning activity or the waves of activity that are to come. And to be able to be well prepared for that, we need to identify the current and future capabilities that are required to execute on that activity. And so this study was very much focused on looking at what the skill requirements are and what the most critical capabilities are for Australia to be aware of and prepare for the future. In order for us to go ahead with this work, we really determined the importance of assessing what's already available in the Australian market, particularly in the oil and gas sector, but also adjacent sectors. Identify what those skills are that currently exist across relevant industries, but also to align it to the well-known work breakdown structures of key activity that occurs across onshore and offshore oil and gas work, and then to conduct a gap analysis of what we think is required for the future versus what we have now, and start to propose some solutions or strategies as to how these identified gaps can be addressed. So in terms of the work that we did, it was quite a significant piece of research that was undertaken over a short period of time, so over about 8 weeks of work last year, around middle of last year. And during this time, CODA and Deloitte worked really closely together to co-design a methodology and an approach that was going to help us to determine how we can identify the gap that exists from a workforce perspective. We were really fortunate that from a consultation perspective, we were able to engage a lot of different stakeholders across the industry and adjacent industries, and ultimately get the views from current oil and gas title holders and service providers, but also the public sector, regulatory bodies and key industry groups, including universities, higher education services and unions as well. We also engaged with international experts who were willing to spend some time with us to give us insight to some of the learnings from their more mature decommissioning activities across the world, particularly from Norway and the UK, and that helped to shape what we can do to prepare better in Australia. So in terms of consultations, we held 24 one-on-one consultations, and this was again across the stakeholders that you can see on the right-hand side of the screen. And we also held 3 focus groups. The focus groups were broken down into hearing from oil and gas title holders, a separate session with service providers, and then another session with any public sector regulatory bodies and key industry groups. Simultaneously, while we were doing the consultation, we also launched a survey to gather some insights from a broader range of stakeholders than what we could cover through direct engagement. And the survey yielded a really strong response. We had 46 different organisations or stakeholders respond to give us their insights. And today we're going to take you through the key findings from the study, which is a combination of the consultation summary that you can see here that helped us to gather those insights, as well as some extensive desktop research and understanding from CODA's wealth of knowledge in this space and other stakeholders who are willing to informally share their feedback with us. So before I get into the key findings, I think what's really important to share with you all is that there were some very obvious strengths in terms of the decommissioning industry in Australia in its current nascent stage, which is important to reflect on, but also help us to propel moving forward. And that is that, first of all, and very importantly, there is a commitment from the industry to learn and prepare together. And we believe that this commitment will really help to shift the focus into the future on what decommissioning activity needs to look like in Australia. There seems to be some really strong international experience and local experience in the decommissioning space that we can really leverage. So our ability to leverage those existing skills and talent forums, either because of the skill sets that already exist within the sector or decommissioning of assets that are currently in place or have in the past in Australia that can be leveraged as well. I think the main message we got there is that we're not starting from scratch. There are certainly some experience that we can leverage, but how do we grow that in terms of volume to meet the demand that's coming up? There's certainly a willingness to further collaborate and connect, which is really nice to see, particularly given the nature of decommissioning and the focus of that sometimes seen from an individual title holder perspective rather than as a collective view. So through all of our consultations, we were really pleased that everyone that we reached out to was willing to engage with us and also demonstrated that desire to continue to engage with each other across the industry, because there is a mutual understanding that the better prepared we are as an industry collectively together, the better we'll be able to manage the demand and the volume of work to come. And also there's a desire for innovation. So whilst there's an opportunity to learn from other more mature parts of the world who are involved in decommissioning activity, there's also a really strong focus on innovation and improvement based on technologies and processes that either we can adopt from other parts of the world or we can try and develop ourselves here in Australia. So there was a very strong emphasis on ensuring that we had clear planning in order to collaborate and optimize the opportunity to leverage innovation, research, technology, etc., particularly when it comes to plug and abandonment, waste management, recycling and disposal, which are areas that certainly Australia needs to shift forward in order to meet the demand that's coming in the future, not just with decommissioning some of our aging assets here in Australia, but also adjacent industries that will require the same focus on skills and capabilities. So I might just pause there briefly because that's a lot of information. But I'll also then go into our main findings. So what we've gathered in terms of findings, there are several key findings that we have identified from our study, but ultimately we'll try and focus on the ones that are related to workforce opportunities. What is really pleasing to see is that we already have a lot of the skills and capabilities that the decommissioning industry requires already within the industry, the oil and gas industry in particular. But the challenge will be to meet the demand that's coming with the current pool of talent. And a part of that challenge is we still don't have a clear idea of what the volume of work will look like. And so being able to get an understanding of what that work looks like, what those activities look like, will help us to meet the gap between supply and demand. There's also a appeal from other industries that is going to impact the accessibility to talent. So particularly with the younger generations. We found through our study that the appeal of working in green energy and renewable sectors, or looking for opportunities outside of oil and gas, may create some talent movement that's going to impact the availability of resources to support decommissioning. So that's a real challenge that we need to focus on in the future to meet. But there are some innovative ways that we can do that. And again, that cross collaboration and engagement will really help to support that. So whilst we understand that there might be some challenges in attracting and retaining talent, it's also really important for us to understand that planning and understanding the volume of activity to come will help us to be able to create more meaningful career pathways and create some assurance from our talent pools that there is a lot of work in this space that will be appealing for them and create job security for them in the future. If I keep moving on to some other interesting findings from the study, there's certainly an opportunity for us to learn from the experiences of others. So I mentioned Norway and the UK in particular because these mature jurisdictions have been involved in large volumes of decommissioning work for decades, and there's an opportunity for us to learn from their experiences, and they are certainly willing to share with us. So some of our title holders that work across multiple jurisdictions will already benefit from the knowledge and experiences that their own organisations are facing in decommissioning assets across other parts of the world. But there is an opportunity for us to leverage from that experience, as well as some of the key agencies and associations in other jurisdictions who want to share and propel the work that's been done in Australia. There is also obviously a vested interest on their part in understanding the volume of work that is to come from Australia, because the demand or competition for assets, and in particular vessels and rig infrastructure, is going to be felt at a global level. And as the world prepares for that increased demand coming from Australian infrastructure needs as well, or decommissioning needs, then they will certainly have a vested interest in ensuring that that planning is something that they take into consideration. So in many ways, there's lots that we can learn, but also that we can share effectively with other jurisdictions. Adopting new ways of working and engaging with research was found to be really important as we prepare Australia for decommissioning activity. Through our consultation, we engaged with research organisations and some other higher education providers, and we found that the opportunity to really skill our workforce and propel them towards the nuances and needs of decommissioning activity, as well as engage with researchers and develop innovative new technologies, or understand marine life and the ecology of the environments in which some of our assets need to be considered to optimise and enable decommissioning activity is really critical and clear. And there's certainly an appetite within these key agencies or institutions to support the decommissioning agenda. So we should make the most of that and involve them wherever possible in the journey. Leveraging transferable skills and capabilities from across the oil and gas industry is absolutely imperative for being able to meet the needs of the future in decommissioning. There is a duality in Australia where we will have ongoing production at the same time as the decommissioning of ageing infrastructure. And so the opportunity for us to ensure that we really engage our current Australian oil and gas industry employees to understand the importance of staying within the sector and to transfer their existing skills and capabilities to decommissioning activity is really critical. And Kristy will talk a little bit more about what those skills and capabilities are that we should really focus on in the next section. I think as I wrap up the findings, it's really important for us to acknowledge that there is a need for a mindset shift to help us to prepare and deliver on decommissioning activity in Australia. What this really means is we need to understand and be open-minded about decommissioning, and a part of that may be even rebranding decommissioning to not necessarily seem as kind of unimportant or at the back end of the value chain of activities for the sector, but really rebanded around a decarbonisation agenda or a renewables agenda, so that we can try and generate that interest and also that opportunity for the future, because we know that this industry is a 50 billion plus industry over waves of opportunity within the next decade plus, and there's really a lot of need for us to engage the workforce to see this as important work. So general situational awareness, particularly when it comes to health and safety challenges, the environment and the impact on the environment through the work that's being done in decommissioning, and reducing that impact to leave our environment in the best place possible, is really critical to shift that mindset and to raise the level of optimism and focus on decommissioning activity. And certainly, last but not least, we've spoken a little bit about the supply and demand side. And so in order for us to leverage the existing workforce within oil and gas, but also to build new skills and build a new muscle in our workforce for the future, we need to develop fit-for-purpose training facilities that will enable the industry to actually be able to deliver on the workforce needs of the future. And the development of that fit-for-purpose training doesn't just lie with the title holders in their own backyards, but actually lies with the solution of collaboration across the sector and with our higher education, tertiary and training partners, to be able to develop that training and education material, as well as infrastructure and opportunity through engaging in courses, etc., to learn from each other, to propel ourselves forward and ensure that Australia is well prepared for the wave of work to come. Kristy, I might pass it over to you now to talk a little bit more about some of the key insights we gathered from a workforce capability need perspective.
Great. Thanks, Ashani. And just a reminder, everyone, if you wanted to ask questions as we go through, there is a Q&A function. So please feel free to pop any questions into that, and then we'll have a Q&A section at the very end. So in relation to key capabilities and skills that are in demand as we take that forward view on the decommissioning industry, so we had the opportunity through the survey that Ashani mentioned to hear from 46 different respondents in relation to the types of capabilities they are seeing as most important, the current level of capability, as well as anticipated future state capability level, as well as insights around scarcity in today's market. And what you can see in front of you is a couple of different reflections of the data that we were able to collate. So to start with, we had to kind of hone in on some priority skill sets. So there were 12 capability areas that were prioritized as a part of the study. And I think there's opportunity to expand that into considering kind of greater areas of operational workforce and supporting workforce in future studies. But for the intent of this piece of work, there were 12 capability areas that we had a look at. And you can see them listed on the right-hand side in terms of what come back from the respondents in relation to the most important capability areas. So you can see there that environment management was actually rated as number 1, and logistics and facilities management was rated as number 12. But we were also then able to understand the gap in kind of capability level, proficiency level, as well as then the scarcity factor as well. And when we were able to look at those 3 different dimensions, we could really hone in on those areas that were going to be critical in relation to the industry being able to solve for the skills that they need in the future. And we wanted to kind of hone in on kind of the ones that you can see there that are highlighted more in the yellow, and I'll kind of share some of the key insights from those. So as Ashani mentioned already, recycling, decontamination and waste management really come out as a top priority in terms of, mid-table in terms of importance, but in terms of actually understanding and being able to acquire the level of capability that we need in future, that was one that was observed as a significant gap. When we think about the capabilities that we have in Australia in relation to recycling and waste management, we don't have a very big industry in that space, so there's a lack of recycling practices and facilities in Australia. And the infrastructure and capability gap is seen not only in the decommissioning industry, but also across other industries as well. So that's definitely one which will need to be solved for kind of as a collective, both at the Australian level as well as specifically for the decommissioning industry. Another one that kind of popped up was around the decommissioning program planning and reporting. So again, we observed a significant gap in this capability. And whilst we acknowledge that it's easy to be able to access those particular capabilities and skills from across other industries, they still will need training and education in relation to understanding the nuances of decommissioning and the mindset required in decommissioning to be able to then support the safe and efficient decommissioning practices. Similarly with engineering, technical and operational skills to support topside substructure, subsea preparation and removal. Again, we have these skills within Australia, but it is about then being able to apply them in that decommissioning context. It's interesting as well, and Ashani has mentioned it in relation to starting to see some of the workforce movement, but it will be important for the decommissioning industry to be able to attract some of those capabilities and those individuals out of their existing industries, which might be kind of in the mining or construction space, to be able to attract them into decommissioning and be able to support them with the capability and skill build that they'll need to be successful in the decommissioning space. Another one around plug and abandonment, again, similar to the engineering and technical space. We do have these roles, but we're going to need to be able to attract them into the decommissioning industry. And regulatory compliance management is going to be one that's very interesting for individuals to be able to navigate. So given the industry is at a nascent stage and the regulatory and policy framework is currently very complex, there's a gap in this capability for the decommissioning industry, and one that will certainly need to be built as the regulatory landscape evolves as well. So what we did find from the skills study, and I've kind of done a call out on a couple of the priority ones, but we can see that there is capability available in a number of these different areas. There certainly will be the requirement in relation to education and training and helping them understand the skills, capability and mindset that they need to be able to demonstrate and embrace within the decommissioning industry. But we certainly, we were able to find some brighter spots in relation to capabilities that can transfer over, but certainly some priority areas that will need to be addressed and supported as we grow as an industry moving forward. And Ashani, would you like to share kind of some insights in relation to some of the case studies that you were able to understand better through some of your international consultation as well?
Yeah, thank you, Kristy. So as I mentioned before, we did engage some international experts, and they were very generous with their time and their ability to share what they've been able to do through their maturity in this decommissioning space. Overall, I think some of the things that we found was that given the maturity that they have in other markets, particularly the North Sea, UK and Norway, they have made some remarkable strides in enhancing the forecasting accuracy of decommissioning activities. And I think that that's probably one of the biggest hints or opportunities for us in Australia to understand what that volume of work looks like, what the forecasts are that are coming up over the next decade and beyond, if possible, so that we can plan and prepare together. So the first case study that we'd like to share with you was from the North Sea Transition Authority, or NSTA, in the UK. And they shared with us that they developed a digital supply chain tool, which was aimed to make projects in the North Sea more efficient. So as part of this, they came up with a supply chain action plan, or SCAPS as they call it. And it's a process that was rolled out in 2018 to ensure that all of the different activity that was occurring within North Sea, the different projects that are going on, were actually captured and shared effectively across different stakeholders. This enabled the title holders to cooperate more openly early on in project life cycles of decommissioning activity, and therefore NSTA was able to monitor any of the changes in costs, identify any gaps in the supply chain capability, and also share best practice learnings from what they gathered through this particular action that they took. So this is a really great insight that we should also learn from in Australia in terms of our ability to share, our ability to forecast and plan, our ability to, where possible, determine where those gaps are in the supply chain and the implications of that from an infrastructure management perspective and a workforce management perspective. And the more we can collaborate and learn and share with each other, the better we'll be able to take the lessons from not just other jurisdictions, but the lessons that we learn from that volume or the bursts of decommissioning activity that we will face here in Australia, or already have started to face in Australia, and take that forward for our benefit as a whole of industry approach. The other case study that we thought was really interesting to share was more from a recycling lens. And this is a case study from Denmark. So we call it MARS for short, but it's Modern American Recycling Services in Europe. And essentially, this initiative was a 2-year program that Denmark put some effort into to implement a system where disengaged youth within the community were almost repurposed or refocused in terms of their energy and their time to actually be employed by the decommissioning industry in Denmark. And so this particular program was how disengaged youth were employed to actually be involved in recycling material. And that has been a really successful case study in Denmark, and a really great opportunity for how Australia can leverage from this example to determine how we engage with either our disengaged youth, or how we engage different parts of the workforce that are untapped in our regional and remote communities, for example, to be able to contribute to the decommissioning agenda. Again, we know that the gap between what we need from a workforce perspective and what we have is only going to grow. And particularly when we look at the regional and remote communities, where a lot of our decommissioning of assets will need to either be brought through to, in terms of ports, land, infrastructure, our opportunity to really engage in new workforces that we can develop and propel into supporting these initiatives is really strong and clear. There's also an opportunity for us to embrace here that decommissioning activity in Australia is not going to happen in isolation. In fact, we know that some of the key infrastructure, the land, the yards, the disposal yards, etc., that we require in Australia is going to be servicing and need to involve other adjacent industries like offshore wind, for example, and other renewables. And so being able to leverage case studies like this, where we can bring in extra parts of the workforce that have been untapped so far, whether it's our First Nations populations, our regional and remote populations, or even disengaged youth, for example, there are great opportunities for us to innovate and learn and make sure that we move forward. There are also some other really great examples of learnings from other international jurisdictions that we haven't captured here on slides, but is worth me mentioning. For example, in Norway, there's a mandatory workforce supply information database that is going to be made publicly available. And the intention there is to support an understanding of where the workforce is playing a role towards decommissioning activity. This insight being shared across the country is really helpful to mitigate some of those gaps between supply and demand, but also through that visibility, be able to create much more compelling and secure workforce career pathways to try and prevent those shortages and to engage people within the sector. Also, scrapyards have been developed in Turkey, Norway, and Denmark to be able to break down material, whether it's vessels or platform infrastructure, etc. And the opportunity for us to really think about what that means for land use in Australia, particularly as we are so geographically dispersed, and we do have shallow waters and deep waters in certain parts of Australia that will be risky in terms of the infrastructure that we create. I think there's a really strong opportunity for us to learn from other regions, but also consider the different factors that are playing a role in what we can and can't do in our own backyard. The last fact that I'll leave you with is that in Norway, probably no surprise given how progressive they are, but I thought it was an interesting statistic that 98% or approximately 98% of steel from offshore decommissioning activity in Norway is actually being repurposed to build structures like offshore wind turbines. So again, contributing to that circular economy, contributing to how we actually recycle and utilize our materials is really a good learning and opportunity for Australia as well. Kristy, I'll pass over to you in terms of talking through next steps and opportunities to move forward.
Great. Thanks, Ashani. And I think the first one was really based on the insights that we did gain from some of those international conversations, and one that we did learn from Francis on Friday at the launch at the AOG conference that CODA have actually already kicked off, which was consolidating a view of upcoming decommissioning activities. So how as an industry can we get a really solid view of what is in plan to then support some broader, I guess, supply and demand kind of modelling and forecasting to then be able to have a full view of some of those skills that are required and when and in what volumes to support then organisations and the industry as a whole to be making key decisions together where that makes sense. Number two was very much linked to that. So bringing the sector together. So rather than kind of the independent parties looking to solve their part of the challenge independently, it was looking for a way to bring together the education, the learning, the kind of industry bodies, and the role that CODA can play in really facilitating that network and building out those solutions in relation to the common challenges that need to be addressed in attracting people into decommissioning as an industry, being able to grow those critical capabilities, and through some of those initiatives that Ashani has shared so far. Building out a detailed view of critical capabilities is the next big lever in our mind in terms of being able to develop a strategic workforce plan as an industry to look at the supply and demand for different capabilities over periods of time, and looking at then also what the international activity could be shaping up like, because we are drawing upon critical and scarce capabilities for some of these roles, as I highlighted earlier. So how then, as a part of being able to borrow capabilities from overseas and bringing them into the Australian market to be able to support the uplift of capability here, how are we doing that in a way that's actually supportive of a broader global industry as well? And really important, building local capability. So of those critical capability areas that we've highlighted, especially ones where we're coming from a low base, so very high scarcity levels, how can we actually look to have the right learning pathways in place, the right qualifications and education solutions in place to be able to support the growth in those capabilities as well. Then in terms of the next initiative, so leveraging that international expertise. So Ashani found some really wonderful case studies and had some great connections kind of globally as a part of this. And Francis certainly does play a role in building these international connections as well. But how are we actually leveraging that capability and that expertise to be able to support the decommissioning activity in Australia? I think, as Ashani mentioned, there's a high interest in being able to collaborate and innovate in this space. So how are we actually being really deliberate about how we're doing that? Engaging talent and expertise from other industries. So this is one that we have highlighted throughout the study and was a key theme. So where the skills do exist in the current kind of talent market, but how are we able to actually bring them into decommissioning? So that is things like being able to ensure that we've got compelling employee offerings around that remuneration can be competitive and attractive, that the terms and conditions of employment are attractive, that the kind of training and career pathways are clear, but also how we're able to kind of work across related industries. So we kept coming up against offshore wind as one example in terms of having high transferability of skills between those two different disciplines. So how could we actually look at leveraging the growth in capability at a national level, but something that could potentially benefit both industries as well. And just the branding as well around decommissioning. So how are we looking at the opportunity to position this as a really positively impacting industry in terms of environmental concerns, which we do know from a lot of the generational studies that Deloitte do deliver kind of year on year, that we're seeing our Gen Z and our millennial workforce, and no doubt Generation Alpha as they come through as well, are really looking to work in careers that are having a positive impact from a societal perspective and an environmental perspective. So that's really important. I think what will be key as a part of that is the level of stakeholder and community engagement that needs to occur. And that was one capability set I didn't call out in the earlier session, but that will be key in terms of the level of consultation and discussion with local communities as we look at the location for some of the decommissioning activities. So how are we looking at that as key opportunities to engage and position decommissioning as a really positive impact. And then attracting and engaging talent by addressing key workforce challenges. So it will be around, the working conditions, the health and safety consideration, remuneration, working through the industrial relations kind of environment, which is complex in itself at the moment, let alone over the next kind of 10 years or so. So what is it that as an industry and as employers within that industry, what can each of the different parties be doing in relation to addressing some of those key workforce challenges and issues as well. And then kind of moving on to the final couple, collaborating with industry for an impactful change. So really being able to drive rapid and impactful change through collaboration with really deliberate intention and action. So very much that collaborating together to solve it as one will be really important. Engaging with local communities, I did touch on kind of just previously as well, but we think that will be really important. And augmenting work design based on the workforce plan that's developed. So quite often when we go into different skills studies, there's an assumption of it all needs to be human workforce and where are we going to find them from, and we're competing across industries for scarce skills. We think there's a real opportunity from a decommissioning industry perspective to be actually critically challenging the work that we need our valuable humans kind of delivering, and where are those opportunities to be potentially leveraging technology in different ways to be able to do those jobs that don't use the best of our uniquely human capabilities, but can be kind of highly repetitive, volume-based and kind of rule-based working that gives that opportunity to be able to do that. So everyone is talking about generative AI at the moment and kind of looking for key opportunities to be able to embrace that. And we think that there's definitely that opportunity, whether or not it's Gen AI, automation, some type of technology, but being really deliberate in terms of all those critical capabilities that we need to make the industry successful. Which of those key activities could we be using a different type of talent and building kind of integrated teams of uniquely human skills, and those digital skills to be able to deliver work in a different way. So those were the 11 key recommendations that we come up with off the back of that. So would now welcome any kind of final comments from you, Frances, and also we can just open up in terms of any of the questions that any of the participants on the webinar today may have.
Oh, that's excellent. Thank you both for very comprehensive walk through the report. I'll comment on one of the comments that you made, and then I'll maybe ask a few questions. We've had a few questions that have come in through the on the chat line. But if you've got any questions that you'd like now to pose, please do chuck them in there, and we will endeavour to get to them as quickly as we can. You mentioned your finding number one about the forward look ahead, the outlook for what the workload looks like, and you're dead right that late last year we kicked off a project. We're working with a Perth-based AI company. Interestingly enough, they're using some natural language processing and an artificial intelligence platform to scrape all of the environmental plans that the operators produce that are held by NOPSEMA. And from that to harvest all of the information pertinent to decommissioning. So when that goes live in maybe 6 weeks or so's time, we're envisaging that it will have a pretty comprehensive catalogue of everything that's installed in the water. So we're starting with the NOPSEMA space, everything that's installed in the water, all the pipelines, platforms, structures and such like. We're also integrating into it a lot of the data from the NOPIMS data set that NOPTA manage, which has all of the wells data as well. So there'll be a lot of wells information in there as well. And then along with all of that, we're going to overlay all of the anticipated decommissioning information from those EPs. So either either a COP date, if it's a facility that's a long way out in the future, that's got many, many years of operational life ahead of it, or if it's one that's more immediate as far as its decommissioning, some of the more detailed dates that are in there as well. So that will be, hopefully that will go live in about the next, let's say the next 6 weeks. May even be the topic of the next webinar. We've just got to wait and see in terms of where all that lot goes. So that one is trundling along from our side. There was one question on the chat which I will address, and then I'll ask you the next one. So we've had 2 questions from Thor, so thank you very much for getting in with those. The $60 billion that you asked about in there, that is essentially for all of the offshore equipment. So that was the work that CODA did way back in 2020, 2021 in what was referred to as the liability study, and that looked at all of the offshore materials. There were a couple of pockets of offshore that it didn't include for various reasons, but essentially that $60 billion is offshore only. It's wells, structures, pipelines, platforms, floating facilities and everything else. It doesn't include any of the onshore well stock. It doesn't include refineries, terminals and such like. Of that 60 billion, around about 40% is wells. Also of that 60 billion, we believe around about 50% of that spend is going to occur in this decade that we're now in. So whether that's the decade that runs out to 2030 or the decade that runs from 2024 until 2034, I'm not exactly sure, but it's somewhere in that time period. Most of that is going to get spent. Now, to the questions. The first one, I'll go with Thor's other question before I get to a couple of others that I have jotted down here. His question, we've got in the landscape of decommissioning, we've got the authorities, we've got the owners, we've got the contractors, we've got NGOs, we've got unions. When you talk about we in the work that you've done, who is we? And can you sort of maybe contextualize a little bit of your thoughts around that as well, please?
Yeah, no problem. I can take that one. So when we refer to we, I think we wanted to have a collective voice of who we consulted through the process. And I think at a high level, we gave you a bit of an idea of the different types of stakeholders that we engaged with. So without revealing any particular organizations or anything like that, it was a broad overview of feedback that we received from various different groups, whether it's the title holders, the service providers, and then those key industry groups we mentioned, the regulatory bodies and the public sector agencies. So our report was very much gathered on a thematic analysis of the key things that were raised that were important or pertinent for the decommissioning industry to take forward. And I think the we is strongly mentioned only because through our study, at least, there was no hesitation from the stakeholders that we engage with around propelling forward and working together. So we spoke to unions, we spoke to research organisations, we spoke to service providers, etc. And there was a collective will from those that we communicated with around the need to prepare and unify and engage with decommissioning activity together. Now, we understand that that might seem a little bit, naive or might seem a little bit overly optimistic. But the reality is that if we don't work together, and again, this is what we learned from the other jurisdictions as well, if we don't work together, it just makes this work harder. And the reality is it needs to get done. So look, it's at the, back end, or unfortunately, it's considered at the back end of the value chain of production or operations, when it should be considered even when we're commissioning new activity. There aren't necessarily financial incentives that anyone's going to see from this process, particularly the title holders. So there are lots of reasons as to why it's going to be a challenge, but the we was intended to reflect the collective voice through our thematic analysis that people want to work together, regardless of which part of influence they have over decommissioning activity. The want or the desire to work together to plan and prepare is really clear.
Excellent. So it's we is all of us. Yep. It's the whole shooting match. One of the one of the statistics that I was drawn to when I looked through the report was where you asked the three different sectors, if you like, of the correspondents around their own confidence in their own abilities to do this work, and then the confidence that they saw in either in their peers or in their in the broader landscape. I found those numbers quite jarring, that typically when you looked at them, it was, well, we as a company, we are super good at this, but you as everyone else have a long way to go. Can you comment a little bit on your professional view of that? Because I mean, I'm looking at this as someone working in the industry. You ladies look at this sort of stuff as, that's your bread and butter.
Yeah, no problem. Kristy, did you want to go or shall I?
I was just going to say there's actually quite a common finding in relation to confidence in own ability, but seeing the gaps in others. So I think that we can actually see that kind of play out in different surveying tools for lots of different reasons. And I think we've seen it a little bit here. I did note, with the different parties that we were able to engage, the service providers were probably those respondents who quite often would call out the gaps that they had or that they saw in terms of current capability to future. So I think there was a recognition and acknowledgement of the challenge that's in front of them and potentially how they scale and build the capability that they need for future. But yeah, it was just a general comment, Francis, that's not uncommon when we do any kind of self-reflection and reflection on others, and we tend to think that we're doing pretty well, but we can notice the gaps in others' performance as well. But Ashani, any other comments, I guess?
I totally echo that from a reporting perspective, in that self-reporting typically, and if we take it outside of the topic of conversation to just, your 360s, your typical assessments that you might need to do even at an individual level, self-reporting tends to have more favoritism towards self than others' views of you. But I think in addition to that, and there might be a layer of that in the insights that we gathered, it also reflects the different levels of maturity and involvement in decommissioning across the stakeholders that we spoke to. So some of the title holders that we spoke to, for example, are actually quite mature in their understanding and experience of decommissioning, either through activity that they're currently engaged with here in Australia or because of the multinational nature of their organisations and having exposure to some of those global decommissioning activities or expeditions. So certainly that has a part to play in how they might have viewed their preparedness compared to others. And I think, again, really important to highlight Kristy's point around the service providers. I think the service providers have a really large role to play in the value chain of decommissioning activities. And whilst that's exciting and a great opportunity, there's lots of challenges with that as well. And so perceptions from service providers around their ability to actually do what they'd like to be doing is probably compounded by so many different factors, and that could have contributed to their perceptions of why they might be more prepared than others in the sector, particularly, say, title holders that they ultimately will be holding contracts with to be delivering on the part of work. So there's probably multiple factors that are contributing towards that.
Very good, thank you. As a general question then, that when you looked at the skills and the conversations that you had and the consultations that you had and so forth, would I be right to say that most of the skills that we're looking for are going to be supplementary to sort of the more general skill pool that we would already have? Would that be a fair comment? And are there any areas where you felt from the work that you did where these are very specific decommissioning focus skills as opposed to the more general skills? You're muted, Kristy.
I think there are definitely, so the skills study didn't take into account all skills that will be needed in terms of being able to make the decommissioning work within Australia. So it doesn't yet potentially consider more in terms of the operational workforce, the enabling services and those types of things. So that would just be kind of disclaimer number one. I think aside from those couple that I did kind of call out, which were were really seen by the respondents as quite critical, with those kind of larger gaps in terms of the capability uplift that's required, that aren't necessarily fully just about grabbing existing people that might be working in the working in the industry and giving them a little bit of retraining, refocus, mindset shift, those things, and then equipping them for decommissioning. But around the recycling, decontamination, and waste management was probably the top one, just because of the level of maturity of that industry in Australia, full stop. So I think we've got a scarcity challenge and a capability challenge, and it was seen as, in the top 5 in relation to kind of importance. So I think that one is a particular challenge. And I think that regulatory compliance management as well was seen as important, and then from a capability gap perspective, because that is going to be a complex environment. So being able to understand all of those different elements and kind of navigate those, I think, will be quite key. Some of them, yes, will be just that retraining opportunity. So health and safety, and environment management, the top 2 rated in relation to importance, but we are actually pulling upon a quite a solid capability pool within Australia across those. So there is that kind of a little bit of retraining and equipping them for decommissioning, but they weren't necessarily flagged in terms of the criticality gap or the scarcity gap, or the capability criticality as well. So I think there's it is having to look at all 3 dimensions in relation to the skills that we need to focus in and around one first.
Very good. Right, so we've had a couple more questions come in. So I'll ask you this one, but I'm happy to take most of it myself as well.
Okay.
Any new changes going to be made, included in decom legislation in general, in particular for the time frame for removal from the time of COP? Now, maybe I'll take that one and let you have a ponder if there's anything that you're aware of from a workforce and skills perspective. Look, my understanding is that there is an ongoing consideration of modifications around the legislation, both at the state and at the federal level, of decommissioning as industry just matures. We saw back in 2019, 2020 with the Northern Endeavour situation that led to a fairly significant change to quite a lot of the legislation. And I know there's sort of ongoing consideration of just various little aspects of that, particularly I think in the onshore space. Western Australia's got a review underway at the present around some of its onshore regulations. I wouldn't be at all surprised around the middle of this year, when the offshore decommissioning roadmap work that the federal government have been working on, that there's some narrative in there around some legislative reviews. Whether that legislative changes or not, I guess, just remains to be seen. Certainly also the NOPSEMA, the offshore regulator, have become very vigilant around timeframes for decommissioning. And that again was part of the sort of the fallout, if you like, from the Northern Endeavour piece. And that's really what's led to a lot of the focus on activity right now as industry works through playing a catch-up game with the material that was there. Ashani and Kristy, are you aware of anything coming through, particularly in the workforce side of things, that would go to that question?
I'm not aware of anything specifically, Francis, but I wouldn't be surprised of the implications of that with the ongoing nature of the legislative side. So I think that's a watch this space thing. And again, we're still having short bursts of activity, but as this progresses, there's no doubt going to be legislative changes as well as workforce implications that will need to be considered.
Very good, thank you. There's a question here specifically for us. Does CODA have any current or future role in connecting the dots from this skills review, for example, connecting people who are interested in working in decom space with potential employers, clearing some barriers for them, and so forth? Look, to try and address part of that question, we developed 2 years ago, and we delivered twice last year, an introduction to decom training course, which we make available as a public course. This particular course started life as something developed by Curtin University for NOPSEMA, and we inherited it, as I say, 2 years ago. That course will run again a couple of times this year, and that's intended to provide an opportunity to upskill quite broadly across the whole of the decommissioning industry for people who are either new to decom or have an interest in getting involved in there. Off the back of this study, we're going to start working with, in fact, we already have started some conversations with some of the vet sector, particularly with some of the TAFEs, and more broadly speaking, with some of the federal government initiatives as well around training, and to try and find ways where we can identify and then fill some of the gaps in this space. We are very aware that there is going to be a pressing need for some of these skills as we go forward. It's trying to find the best ways to fill the skills gaps and the skills knowledges, particularly to your point, Kristy, around things like decontamination. Those, and working with contaminants as well. Those are going to be some real key areas for us to focus on as we go forward. So, I guess it's a watch and wait on that one. And then the other question here, since training and skill development is high, what sort of budget have you included for training? Oh heavens, where to answer that one as a small not-for-profit that's really trying to flag things up? We ourselves have a very small amount of money allocated toward working with industry and working with the education sector as well around developing some of these skills. I think there will be a broad requirement across industry, in the service sector and in the operators and in the regulators and in everybody else to find ways to make sure that the staff that they have the right skills as they go forward. So there will be a broad requirement, I think, for industry to make sure that they are providing the right skills and the right training at the right time for the people as they have going forward. Ladies, do you have anything you'd like to add to that from that side of things? No? Okay.
Nothing for me. Thanks, Tom.
Nothing
Okay.
from you? No, that's no problem at all. I've got one final question which I'll ask you, which hasn't come in here. It's one I jotted down myself, and then we'll reach the end of our allocated time for this session. You touched on a little bit through what you were talking about, but there are some really significant regional opportunities in this industry, aren't there, as we go forwards? Do you want to add anything particular around that sort of regional versus, let's call it metro opportunities, and what it might look like and how we might fill some of those gaps as well?
Yeah, sure. I'll go, Kristy, and then please feel free to add. I think there's enormous potential in this space. In fact, it's probably quite nice that the volume of decommissioning activity to come ties up nicely with offshore wind and other adjacent industries, because we'll all be leveraging the same infrastructure. And when we consider the volume of offshore platform plug and abandonment work, etc., and infrastructure that will need to be decommissioned, as well as the onshore pipeline work that needs, and other infrastructure that needs to be decommissioned, the obvious need for us to really make sure that we are developing our workforce in rural and regional locations is really critically clear. And it's up to us to make that happen, Francis. I think that what we heard from that case study around Denmark says a lot about the opportunity. In Denmark, they also made sure that they deliberately brought a lot of the infrastructure from offshore onshore to mitigate the risk of a workforce not wanting to work FIFO, and be able to do decommissioning work in a steadier pace and at a 9 to 5 job kind of level, as opposed to working offshore. So I think there's lots of things that we can do here, including making sure that we engage our First Nations, and not just for the work, but because of the wealth of knowledge that they have around their land and weather patterns, and just that connection to country that we would require access to and need to be involved with the work that's to come. So there's a lot there I think we can do to engage communities that we haven't already engaged and build those workforces. I think through our consultations, we heard some service providers in particular that have already really propelled in this space and built good relationships or created their own presence in local communities to develop the workforce. locally. And I think that we just need to see more of that happening and work together to identify those opportunities, ensure that training is available to them in real time and in their own backyards without the commute back to Perth wherever possible. So lots and lots of things that we can do to make this happen. Kristy, anything else to add to that?
Nothing to add, Shani. I think you covered all of it. Great.
Excellent. Look, thank you so much, ladies, for this very comprehensive walk through the material. For those that want to have a read, the public version of the report is available on our website now. You can download it. The full partner version will be available in the next few days. It's just getting its final polish with the designers at the moment. We're expecting to have that available in the partner portal within the next week. Well, within the rest of this week, I should say. Our next webinar possibly will be on our forward look ahead, unless someone jumps in with something else in between. But look, in the meantime, everybody and those who've sat along for the journey with this one, thank you everyone so much for your time, and have a great rest of your day. And we look forward to speaking to you at the next opportunity. Thank you.